any questions about the class quiz. It's going to be about it's going to be on the content that we've looked at kind of during this during the last 4 weeks. Someone question?
So is that quiz just multiple choice? That's not short answer?
Yeah, it'll be multiple choices. And there'll be basically questions to do with romance and realism. So if you've tuned in for a good chunk of the sessions, you won't really have too much trouble doing the quiz. It's not as arduous if anyone's done poetry and poetics as doing the quizzes in poetry and poetics. Any other questions?
How was your big day back?
Who's that? I don't know. I think, all right, let's talk about the second assessment. First thing to note is I've recorded a video. I did it last year. It's a rundown on the second assessment, and I've uploaded it to the assessment page on Collaborate. That video goes for about 20 minutes, and you might find it helpful because it will run through the assessment just like I'm about to do, but it'll also give you an example of how you might like to structure your assessment, because I did note that some people are emailing me kind of towards the end of the week going, you know, how should I frame my analytical questions and where should I put my thesis statement for the first assessment? So that video will go into it in some detail. One thing to note about the video is it says that the assessment is due in session 8 on Wednesday, but it's not, it's due session 7 in class, which is exactly a week from now. So let's just briefly talk about what you need to do for this. Write a plan of your essay that you will write for assignment 3. So we'll have to have a look at the essay questions in a moment. You'll present this plan in class and you'll receive a mark for this. It needs to be around 500 to 750 words, or about 3 to 4 or 5 minutes speaking time. I usually find people go to about 5 or 6 minutes, which will be fine. There's 2 components, the presentation and then the submission of the plan. Some of you may like to present your plan via kind of a screen share, and you just show the class a Word document that has your plan on it and runs through your plan. Some of you may like to create a PowerPoint and do it that way. Both options are perfectly fine in this respect. Can I just ask, for some reason, my slideshow thing, are you seeing requirements for aspects? Yeah, cool. Thank you. So there are 4 aspects to writing your plan. And I should just say from the outset, the whole idea of creating an essay plan is to get you thinking and get you working on writing your long essay, which kind of constitutes the big chunk of the mark that you'll get for this unit. You've got to look at the essay questions, then you've got to convert the essay question you choose into your own argument statement, sometimes called a thesis statement. You can provide 2 thesis statements if you would like kind of feedback on which is going to be the best one. And you'll notice as well, and I should mention this here, you'll get the most amount of feedback for your plan as opposed to other assessments, because I want to set you up to write the best essay you possibly can do. So you'll get a lot of feedback for your plan. Your argument should be an argument. That is like a position, a point of view, or a contention, not just I'm going to compare and contrast, or yes, but no, but this. Try to develop an argument, something that you think you can kind of show in the body of your essay. So develop a thesis statement, that's the first aspect. Secondly, write a scoping statement, which is often called a limiting statement. This is a bit vague sounding. Students always go, what do you mean by a scoping statement? What do you mean by a limiting statement? In short, kind of set out the parameters of what you're going to look at in your long essay. And you can also set out parameters by saying, you know, I'm not going to look at A, B, and C. I'm going to look at D, E, and F. Your scoping statement, in a way, it can kind of be like a little map that you sketch out for the reader that shows them where you're probably going to go in your essay, because it's a plan at the moment. It's not written in stone, but where you may not be going. So you could kind of suggest that I might focus on 3 pivotal scenes in a certain text, or 2 texts. For instance, you might say, I want to look at how romance is represented in Pride and Prejudice when it comes to the marriage proposals, but I want to kind of look at also how marriage is represented when it comes to romance in Wuthering Heights. So try to hone in on those sections. And what I'll try and give you as well in your feedback is maybe some suggestions that, hey, you should check out chapter 23 from Tess of the D'Urbervilles, because that chapter kind of will help you in developing your thesis or prosecuting your thesis. Third point is to write a list of the evidence or sub-arguments you will make to reinforce your main argument. This is almost a little bit hard to do because you're at the preliminary stages, although you really do have 2 weeks now to write your long essay, and your map kind of will be the first half, the kind of beginnings of your long essay. But try to find out those sub-themes, whatever argument you choose, that may be a topic or a sub-theme that kind of you will explore in exploring your bigger argument. Often you'll find that when you kind of develop a thesis statement, as you go about prosecuting it, more little mini arguments or little areas of focus emerge. And the difficulty or the challenge of writing a good essay is recognizing which argument is the controlling argument for your essay, as opposed to the sub-arguments or the smaller arguments, which will come below that and kind of feed into the larger argument. Fourthly and finally, write the academic sources you will use in the essay, the ones you can find, 2 from the readings if you would like. You don't have to choose 2 from the readings, but you do need to find at least 4 academic sources. You can find 2 from the readings and 2 that you may locate in the library or through library databases via academic journals as well. To this point, what I'll also be doing is making a video kind of suggesting places where you can find good research material for your essays. And I'll be doing that kind of via the VU website, but also going into databases and areas, because I notice a lot of students, someone brought this up last week at the end of the class, was saying, you know, I go into the VU website and I find these journal articles, but I can't seem to access them. Often you can access them, but you can't access them directly through the VU library website. You've got to go to an academic database in one of the database areas to access them. So I'll make a video kind of hopefully helping you guys find not just academic journal material that kind of ticks the box of being peer reviewed and whatnot, but will also help you mature and develop your argument, because that's the whole idea of looking for secondary source research material, is that it will help enhance your own thinking and help you kind of better understand the text. You'll need to, at the end of your map, kind of have your traditional list of references. This is preliminary. It doesn't need to be written in stone, but kind of you need to start the ball rolling there. Grading criteria. The argument statement will be worth 20 points. The scoping statement will be worth 10 points. Your sub-arguments will be worth 10 points as well. I think if you jump on Collaborate, the rubric might be a little more detailed. I think my kind of discussion in the rundown might be a little more detailed as well. Let's look at the essay questions, but before I kind of start reading them out, does anyone have any questions? Is this like a usual thing that goes on in kind of a lot of units where you have to write a plan?
Yeah, I've had to do a couple.
Yeah, Olivia, I know you've had to do a couple, right? Because you did poetry and poetics with me. So I apologize for that. I think they're very intent on setting out a lot of units to have a plan. Is this a new thing to a lot of you though?
For university, yes. High school, not so much, but university, yeah.
Yeah. I see the purpose of creating the plans, but I kind of often wonder kind of maybe if they're kind of extremely necessary. Let's just quickly, I might just choose a few questions rather than run through them all because we've got 10 questions here. What I'm also going to do is, some of you may have noticed, may have not noticed, there is a little discrepancy between the slides that are on Collaborate and the slides that I'm using. And that's because we often run out of time to discuss certain themes. For instance, in week 1, session 3, I usually have a kind of 20-minute time slot to talk about the importance of dance in Pride and Prejudice. And I didn't have the time to do that last week. What I'm thinking of doing is, for certain of these questions, I'll make individual videos and upload them to the assessments page, just like the research video I'm going to make. And I'll also make an essay formatting video as well, so that when you're writing up all of your essays, you can jump on and just watch this 5-minute formatting video to see kind of how I should format my essay, or get some advice on how you format it in terms of double spacing, putting page numbers in, maybe creating a title page, and whatnot. Has anyone had a look at the essay questions? That could be another question to ask. Jamie's got a thumbs up. I remember Camille, Amber's got a thumbs up. Remember, Camille, you must have, because you kind of were looking at a few things. Ren's got his thumbs up. So Hayley, have you chosen a question, or you're still tossing it up?
No, I'm just still contemplating, but I've just definitely had a look.
Good. You should all, at this stage, start thinking about what essay question you want to kind of choose to write your long essay on. You'll note also that some of the essay questions don't ask you to write about 2 novels, because you've already written about Pride and Prejudice. For instance, question 3, Hardy's Test of the D'Urbervilles, is primarily a novel concerned with social criticism rather than romance discuss. I think the social criticism there could be read as a more complex euphemism for realism. But as we'll see when we come to look at Thomas Hardy, Hardy is very critical of the romance narrative structure for a variety of reasons. But that question would ask you kind of just to focus on Hardy's Test of the D'Urbervilles. Having said that, if you wanted to include or to contrast certain aspects of Tess with other novels, you could do that as well. But there are 10 questions here, and I will create little mini videos for some of the more ornate ones that you guys are welcome to check out. Question 10 does suggest consulting with your tutor. I guess that's me. I wrote these. Devise your own essay question, but be sure that it will encompass themes of romance and realism. So this last one at the end kind of suggests, hey, if you're passionate about a certain aspect in the novels that we've been looking at, but questions 1 to 9 don't really encompass it, this could be the question for you. What you would do is come up with an essay question, but I would probably email back to you and saying, hey, what are you going to do in terms of talking about romance and realism? So I wouldn't accept kind of any kind of bizarre question. It would have to be on the novels, of course. It would have to be on kind of a certain theme related to the novels that can be found within them. But that question will give you some kind of freedom to pursue something you may be interested in, which is good, I think. Is anyone thinking about coming up with their own question? I find it strange. A lot of people don't come up with their own question, but have a think about it. But my advice is to start thinking about these essay questions, because you need to present your map next Monday. So get cracking on that front. Before I move on, does anyone have any questions on the second assessment?
So just confirming, some of the questions are you can only do certain novels for them, but other ones you can choose for that question, correct? If that makes sense.
Yes. Let's scroll back here. For instance, question.
Like number 6, it looks like you can talk about anything.
Yeah, how much literacy is taken for granted today? For most people living in the early to mid 19th century, being able to read and write was a privilege. Discuss the ways in which 2 of the novels we have read in this unit use romance and realism to promote greater literacy. So, Lachlan, you may have noticed in reading Wuthering Heights, that there is a character who suffers from a reading problem, who's semi-literate or even illiterate. Hurton Earnshaw, for instance, he's been socialized by Heathcliff, basically, to kind of avoid intellectual pursuits to the extent that he can't read. And it's kind of part of the tragedy that kind of becomes kind of romanticized in the second half of the novel when Catherine II teaches Hurton how to read. You may have also, if you think back to Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy's a voracious reader, and he also promotes reading amongst Elizabeth and other characters. So literacy in Pride and Prejudice, however peripheral it may seem, kind of gets romanticized. And when we come to look at Tess as well, Tess has had kind of a basic education, but her ability to read and write kind of gives her a certain amount of agency in certain respects. And you'll also see that in Lady Chatterley's Lover. Being able to read and write well kind of elevates Oliver Mallers, for instance, the working class pseudo-gentleman character, up in social standing. So to your question, Lachlan, it doesn't suggest certain novels, but I would recommend be certain novels where kind of that question would be more relevant, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Cheers.
Yeah, and to that question, and generally, once you guys set upon your essay questions, you can send me an email saying, I've chosen question 8. Do you have any recommendations, particularly what chapters I might want to look at? I mean, you might just be able to, you might not want any advice, but if you're kind of like want to focus on a specific area or somewhere that kind of is specific about what's going on in terms of that question, I will be able to send you an email back going, why don't you check out chapter 46 in Tess? Because there's a kind of juxtaposition between Tess and these pheasants that are getting shot, but they're half dead. Something's going on there. You might want to look at that. So if you choose a question and you're a little bit stumped, send me an email, because my job's kind of technically to help you guys out, not make the tasks more difficult than they should seem. And now my laser's gone crazy, which it always seems to do when I turn it on. Any other questions? Is anyone how are you feeling about going forward? You should get your marks back for the first assessment probably by maybe Wednesday or Thursday. I'll probably mark them all tomorrow. How are we feeling? Are we feeling stressed at all? Are we feeling confident? Is anyone worried?
I missed the bit when you were explaining about the video for the next assessment. Is there going to be a video for the only the essay, or for the essay plan assessment too?
I can create a video. What I'll do, Amber, is there's already a video for the creating your presentation plan on Collaborate right now. I uploaded it this morning.
Okay, cool.
It goes for about 20 minutes. But what I'll do in the assessment 3 long essay description, I'll be putting in a variety of videos. One will be on where you can research and find stuff, because some of you kind of just find it frustrating that the VU website doesn't seem to pull up what you need to help you write your essay. So I'll create a short video on that, but I'll also create a short video on formatting, which I think will help a lot of you guys out across all of your units, because some things I notice is people just never double space, and I don't know if it's just because they don't care or they never put page numbers in. I'll create a video on kind of all of the kind of formatting things that will make your essay, even though perhaps the content isn't diamonds, it will make your essay at least look like a diamond when you submit it. And it will be helpful here, but it will also be helpful for your other units. I've just noticed that a lot of people, I don't think they're being shown how to format their essays, and it's so simple. It'll take 5 minutes for me to show you. I might as well make a video to do that. But I will also, for some of these questions, probably not for all 10, make some mini videos. For instance, there's a question on dance, which I wanted to talk about last week, but didn't have the time. So I'll make a mini video on dance and I'll chuck that in there as well. And I might make a mini video on a few others, and they'll give you some ideas about kind of how you could pursue that question. We will have a session 9, completely on essay writing as well. So we're really going to kind of get you geared up to write good essays, not just in this unit, but whatever units you have after this unit, hopefully. Did that answer your question, Amber?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? Any concerns? We should be feeling good. We shouldn't be feeling stressed. You've basically got a whole week to think about your plan, to focus on the essay question, and you've got a whole nother week to write your long essay. And then after you've done all of that, there's just a short quiz at the end of the unit, and you're on your way to kind of mastering romance and realism. All right, now shall we turn from kind of the assessment 2 rundown to moving away from Pride and Prejudice to Wuthering Heights. Just to double check, you guys are all seeing Mr. Darcy looks like he's kind of just thinking about how perfect he is, and Elizabeth's thinking about how perfect he is. Yeah. And here we've got, this is Heathcliff. Tom Hardy is Heathcliff. Looks like he's just dug her out of a grave. But I don't think, I think Catherine Lindley, sorry, I think she's pregnant at the moment, and she's like run away to the moors. Very different novels, as we shall see. But I wanted to turn from Pride and Prejudice to Wuthering Heights to kind of say, some of you who move away from Pride and Prejudice to Wuthering Heights might think, they don't seem to have anything really in common. How am I going to kind of compare them? How can I kind of think about them concurrently? So before I go on to talk about Emily Bronte and Yorkshire and the context surrounding the composition of Wuthering Heights, and before we get into a reading of a chapter from Wuthering Heights, I might just kind of suggest some similarities between the two novels and then some dissimilarities which often get overwhelmed. So both novels deal in marriage across class divides. There are many characters who are kind of less well off, who marry people that are better well off. But the central kind of tension perhaps in Wuthering Heights is that Heathcliff can't marry Catherine Earnshaw because not so much of class, but for a variety of factors, kind of ethnicity, but also kind of his cultural kind of marginality. The difference perhaps is the class and relations, or the kind of marriage across class, are inverted. So we may remember in Pride and Prejudice that Mr. Darcy says it would be degrading for him to marry Elizabeth Bennet in the first marriage proposal. Well, in Wuthering Heights, it's inverted. Heathcliff is viewed as degrading. Catherine Earnshaw kind of confesses to Nellie Dean that it would be degrading for her to marry Heathcliff. Both novels are about this thing called romantic love. Different types, we'll get to that in a moment. Both novels feature male villains with no family connections. You have Wickham, George Wickham, who is kind of a loner, a villainous loner in Pride and Prejudice. In Wuthering Heights, you have a character like Heathcliff, who kind of comes out of the blue. He's introduced to the family, kind of tabula rasa, kind of out of nowhere. Both novels feature an elopement. Heathcliff and Isabella elope together. I should mention I'm not going to discuss the entire plot of the novel for those of you who are reading it. I won't tell you kind of everything that happens. I won't tell you what happens in the end, but I will kind of talk about some aspects because we have to do that. Of course, Wickham and Lydia, they elope in Pride and Prejudice. So there are similarities. There are also supporting characters who kind of exist to provide comic relief. Remember Mr. Collins, the kind of traditional conservative kind of joke of a religious figure. In Wuthering Heights, you have Crazy Joseph, who's a bit more gothic, a bit more medieval monkish, but he's nonetheless there for a bit of comic relief. Both novels are very conscious of marriage and inheritance laws that were going on during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Differences, I think they are remarkably different novels. One of the big differences you may notice from the very outset is that servants play a central role in the novel. Nally Dean, or Alan Dean, kind of tells the story for most of the narrative. The world's a bit turned upside down in that respect. It's less of a social novel. There's no kind of big galas or balls or things that they go to. There is a bit of a Christmas dinner where a fight happens, but it's not really set around urban centres or even kind of semi-urban rural areas like kind of Netherfield, for instance, or Meryton in Pride and Prejudice, where they're kind of semi-developed, a bit like, say, for instance, Bendigo or Horsham or Shepparton. It's very much right on the peripheries. I came from a small town in Scottsdale in Tasmania, which is kind of very peripheral, very marginal, not many people living there at all. It's a very isolated novel, Wuthering Heights. Death plays a central role in Wuthering Heights, whereas in Pride and Prejudice, no one really dies. The environment's very different. There's not many animals or trees or plants or fungi or moss really mentioned at all in Pride and Prejudice. When you come to read Wuthering Heights, it's very graphic in its ecological consciousness. Having said that, it is an extremely violent novel. And I might mention to those of you who may be put off by reading the novel because you don't kind of like violence, some of the violence seems so absurd that it's somewhat comic. We'll talk about this when we look at the Sublime on Wednesday. It's also quite a radical feminist novel in the sense that it discreetly entertains the possibility that a woman may have two lovers, not just one lover. That's Catherine Earnshaw, of course, who wants both Edgar Linton for economic reasons, but also Heathcliff for her profound love that will never die. The novel's set over decades. Wuthering Heights is kind of a generational novel. It looks at two generations, whereas Pride and Prejudice is set kind of over a cyclical yearly period. It begins in winter, kind of has a winter, and then I think it ends in autumn. They're both about romantic love, but different types of romantic love. Wuthering Heights is often described as the first bodice ripper romance, a kind of romance of kind of extreme kind of tearing your clothes off passion, which you definitely see in certain chapters between Heathcliff and Catherine, where tables and things get overturned and doors get kicked in and Heathcliff just passionately kind of tears through things. Both novels are about love, but a different type of love, in the sense that Wuthering Heights seems to be much more engendered towards this idea of a transcendental realm, a realm beyond the material realm, whereas Pride and Prejudice is very much grounded in the material realities of the social world of Austen's time. Different forms of realism are also at work, and I think we'll look at this when we look at Gothic realism on Wednesday, when it comes to kind of looking at the darker aspects of Wuthering Heights. Anyone kind of think of any other similarities or dissimilarities between them?
I guess it is listed there, but we didn't mention it. The narrative perspective is very different. So we've got like the narrator of Alan and Lockwood versus sort of the omnipotent narrator in Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, great point, Camilla. And we'll hopefully look at that kind of in the second half of today's session when we have a break. Yeah, you have first-person narrative perspectives, and often that's quite the charm of reading Wuthering Heights is there's stories within stories, and often Lockwood's telling the greater narrative, but then you have Nally telling him the narrative of Heathcliff and Catherine's love. But then even within that narrative, you have someone like Joseph telling the story of how Heathcliff is sowing evil in the countryside. It's a bit like Babushka dolls, whereas Austen, you may recall, had that third person omnipotent kind of perspective that would often get in and be quite intimate. So very different in that respect. And I think perhaps why Lachlan and a few others may have enjoyed reading Wuthering Heights more than Pride and Prejudice is first person has a sense of immediacy that third person often doesn't. So great point, Camille. Yes, they're told very differently. All right, let's turn now to kind of talking a little bit about Emily Bronte. And once again, I've kind of gone back in my time machine, and I've got a quote here from Virginia Woolf, who kind of is the go-to person when it comes to understanding great works of English literature. This quote's kind of a bit of mythologization rather than perhaps historical reality. But Woolf, writing in an essay on Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, says that when we think of Emily Bronte, and Virginia Woolf also thought that Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights was a much superior novel when compared to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre for a variety of reasons, particularly because it doesn't have such a wonderful ending. When we think of Emily Bronte, we have to imagine someone who had no lot in our modern world. We have to cast our minds back to the 50s of the last century, to a remote parsonage upon the wild Yorkshire moors. In that parsonage and on those moors, unhappy and lonely in her poverty and her exaltation, she remains forever. This is a bit of mythologization, but nonetheless, it kind of does encapsulate what the Bronte sisters came to mean in terms of the history of English literature, particularly the history of English literature from the north of Britain. Emily Bronte did kind of live a very poor, removed life on the Yorkshire moors. Nonetheless, I think kind of there are some issues with this mythologization because Bronte did kind of live during a period of rapid industrialization. So there was actually a lot going on, but the romantic image of the removed poet kind of has kind of captured people's minds. Emily Bronte came from the north of Britain, kind of all the way up here in Yorkshire, the Yorkshire Dales. It's now a National Heritage site. You recall when we talked about Jane Austen, she came from Hampshire down here in the south. Traditionally, there's been a north-south divide. In a way, the life of Emily Bronte was somewhat similar to the life of Jane Austen in the sense that she was born the second youngest in a family with only one male brother. Bit inverted, you may recall that Jane Austen only had one female sister. All of her siblings tended to be men. She was born kind of not exactly the same economic background, what you might call an educated lower middle class family. Bronte's father, Patrick, for instance, he came from Ireland, and he basically grew up in a very small shack, kind of had not very much money whatsoever, but he was quite a talented kid. He won a Sizer Scholarship to Cambridge and then went on, as a lot of people did, who kind of self-educated themselves during this period to become an Anglican priest. Bronte's mother, however, she died when Emily was only 3 years old. So a lot of death. And if we were to run through all the things that happened in Emily Bronte's life, one of the concurrent kind of stabilizing factors, the thread that goes through her life, is this constant theme of death. when she was growing up, she got some education, but not too much. She attended this school known as Cowan Bridge School. This was a school for the daughters of Anglican priests. It was horrible in terms of what people were fed, kind of where they went to the toilet, the bedding arrangements. They weren't given enough material, so some of the students would get conditions and freeze to death. If anyone's read Jane Eyre, this is the school known as Lowood, a charitable institution for orphan children and undesirables. Kind of as she grew up with her sisters, particularly Anne and Charlotte, she kind of, very much like Jane Austen, wrote a lot of juvenile tales, poetry, and together with her brother Branwell, who I think we'll discuss in a moment, invented the imaginative worlds known as Angria and Gondel, from which a lot of kind of characters from all of the sisters' novels emerged. Growing up as a teenager, kind of, I think she would have had what you would call kind of a late secondary education. Of course, you can't go to university during this period. Unlike her sister Charlotte, who was very ambitious, she wanted to, their big dream was starting a school. Emily really kind of really liked to keep to herself and didn't really want to be an educator. So as Emily and Anne became governesses and tried to kind of start educational institutions, while Charlotte and Anne did, Emily did not. All throughout this period between kind of her childhood, teenage years and young adult years, Emily was writing poetry. She was drawing a lot of pictures. And then in this pivotal period of 1845, 1846, Charlotte, the most ambitious of three sisters, discovered some of Emily's poems, and they hatched this plan to publish them along with some of her own and Anne's poems. So we're going to do this pseudonymously as poems by Currer, Alice, and Acton Bell. As we'll see kind of a bit later, this poetry plan it went through, but it was totally unsuccessful. But out of that, the three sisters kind of kept writing, a bit like when Jane Austen kept getting rejected. They didn't give up, they kept writing. And in 1847, Wuthering Heights was published. The same year, Jane Eyre was published, and the same year, Agnes Grey was published. Agnes Grey was actually published with Wuthering Heights in one volume, or in a triple-decker of the two novels, but it was completely kind of trashed. People didn't like the novel because it was very controversial. The next year, kind of getting all of this news about her novel being terrible, Emily Bronte dies of tuberculosis. So kind of a very sad way to end her life in that respect, because she didn't know that Wuthering Heights would go on to be such a wonderful success. Here we have an image of Emily's home, Bronte Parsonage in Haworth on the Yorkshire Dales. Would anyone like to live here? Does anyone have a turn for the Gothic? Would you like to live at a cemetery?
Wasn't that common to have like plots around your house back in those times?
I'm not too sure. The reason why the cemetery's there is, of course, her father's this Anglican priest, and he kind of, they built the house right next to the cemetery so he could come out when someone died and give a funeral service. Kind of, I don't know, does anyone kind of live anywhere where they're right on a cemetery, or heard of anyone living in a cemetery? I kind of wouldn't mind it myself. Like, I used to live in Parkville, and we used to, when we were kids, go into the general cemetery of Melbourne at night. It was quite a cool place to hang out. But I don't know, I think it would get kind of a little grim sometimes. So Emily, her house, the parsonage, she grew up and kind of died in this area that was kind of very beautiful, but also very, very dark. She was surrounded by death for most of her life, literal death. I'm mentioning this because you're wondering if you've read Wuthering Heights or you're reading through it, why it is such a grim novel. You had this kind of literal or spatial reality of death, but you also had a huge degree of social death. So she grew up in this town called Horworth, which was also industrializing at the time. So a lot of people were coming in to work in industrial factories, particularly cotton mills, but the sanitation wasn't there and a lot of them were dying. So the cemetery was filling up with lots of dead people. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context to kind of why you might see so much death in her novel, sorry. Neither Emily, Charlotte, nor Anne, and this kind of speaks to the issue of gender in the period that we're talking about, were considered belles. Claire Tomeron, a famous biographer of Victorian novelists, she notes that a number of Bronte contemporaries, these are people living and who knew the Bronte sisters, came forward after their deaths to kind of complain about people that were kind of making flattering portraits of the sisters, to attest that the fact that they were just very weird looking women, according to them, according to kind of her contemporaries. And these people were kind of not happy that after the sisters became somewhat immortalized in the 1860s and 1870s, after they'd all died, that they were kind of dressed up to look more attractive. Here we see a famous portrait of the three Bronte sisters. Does anyone want to take a guess which one's Emily? So we've got Emily, Anne, and Charlotte. And has someone been kind of blurred out there in the background? I think that's Emily. That's Anne and that's Charlotte. And as I mentioned before, they did have an elder brother, Branwell, who became addicted to opium and didn't fare so well. And I think in a sad moment of kind of depression, he basically painted himself out of the picture of the three sisters. I do think poor Bromwell gets a hard time. He probably deserves to get a hard time, but it must have been pretty hard growing up with very kind of talented sisters like Emily and Charlotte. The reason why I'm mentioning this issue of gender and beauty when it comes to the Brontes is it's very interesting to look at the significance of the Brontes when it came to aesthetics, because Charlotte, for instance, would become famous, and perhaps one of the first novelists to do this, for writing a romance novel about ugly people. If you read Jane Eyre, you discover that Jane Eyre isn't attractive. She's very ugly. People look at her and think of a toad. Likewise, the hero in Jane Eyre, Rochester, is a preciously grim, kind of not a very attractive figure whatsoever, which was very unconventional for the time. Those of you who have gotten into Wuthering Heights, is Heathcliff a beautiful character? I mean, beauty's kind of abstract. It's in the eye of the beholder, as my grandmother says and my mother says. Camille, what do you think?
I'm thinking, I can't specifically remember where he was described physically, but the vibe I get is sort of this tall, dark and handsome, like Mr. Darcy. Like there's sort of this darkness and like ruggedness and mystery that is appealing.
Yes, mystery is a very central kind of attribute, and we'll look at that in a moment, particularly when it comes to the question of what ethnicity Heathcliff is, because he's described as a lot of things, but Heathcliff kind of is very he's very ambiguously represented, and it's a kind of interesting in a way because he's the lead, he's the main protagonist of this novel, and a bit like Mr. Darcy in a way. It's very vague how he's described, but we're kind of moving ahead in terms of like the development of Western science and the Victorian period in particular. Austen was writing during the Regency period, which came before the Victorian period. the Victorian period really triumphed this idea of the science of physical morality called phrenology, kind of, which also kind of tied into ideas about kind of character and behavior. So looking good looking during the Victorian period was not simply a matter of being desirable or being attractive. Rather, it spoke to scientific ideas about the physiology of morality. So physiognomy was this study that was apparent during the time where you'd actually look at a human being's face to judge their moral character. Phrenology kind of often kind of collapsed into physiognomy, but very different, was the study of the shape of the head or the skull to judge intellectual capability and human character. And I think I've got a few passages in a moment that we'll look at to kind of look at what's going on there. But you'll also see kind of a bit further down when we get to the test of the D'Urbervilles, this concept of atavism coming up, where people would actually judge whether you were a criminal by the shape of your face and your head. So here's two passages from Wuthering Heights on physiognomy and characterization. This is the description of Heathcliff, and Camille kind of, when I kind of asked, is Heathcliff a good-looking character? It's a hard question to ask because he's very ambiguously represented. So this is Nally describing him. Come to the glass and I'll let you see what you should wish. Do you mark those two lines between your eyes and those thick brows that, instead of rising arch, sink in the middle, and that couple of black fiends so deeply buried, who never open their windows boldly, but lurk glinting under them like devil's spies? Wish and learn to smooth away the surly wrinkles, to raise your lids frankly and change the fiends to confident, innocent angels, suspecting and doubting nothing, and always seeing friends where they are not so sure of foes. Don't get the expression of a vicious cur that appears to know the kicks it gets are its dessert, and yet hates all the world as well as the kicker for what it suffers. Is this a flattering kind of sketch of Heathcliff? I might ask, to those of you who haven't started reading Wuthering Heights, is that an attractive person being described, or someone that's kind of a bit fierce looking, perhaps? Devil's spies.
Yeah, I think whenever someone like describes eyebrows that intensely, it's really to make a statement, and it's really to emphasize that they have like a kind of like stoic, almost like aggressive kind of face.
Is that common? Do people often have what lawyers called hard faces? For instance, I believe there was a trial of, I can't remember the name of her, the lady whose baby was eaten by a dingo. If anyone can recall her name, that trial was famous because kind of a lot of the people said the reason why she was judged guilty initially was because she had a hard face. She just looked mean. She didn't look maternalistic. So that kind of rendered her evil. If we look at another passage, this is of Houghton Earnshaw. This is Nally again representing him. I could scarcely refrain from smiling at this antipathy to the poor fellow, who was a well-made, athletic youth, good-looking in features and stout and healthy, but attired in garments befitting his daily occupations of working on the farm and lounging among the moors after rabbits and game. Still, I thought I could detect in his physiognomy a mind owning better qualities than his father ever possessed, good things lost amid a wilderness of weeds, to be sure, whose rankness far overtopped their neglected growth, yet notwithstanding evidence of a wealthy soil that might yield luxuriant crops under other and favourable circumstances. Is this description a lot different from, if you can recall, the description of Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy? Is this much more detailed?
Yeah, I think Bingley and Darcy got like 3 words, like 3 statements about what they look like, and then the rest was about what they owned or how rich they were. Whereas this is like a whole paragraph and even like I guess a metaphor for how he looks as well at the end.
Yeah, with the agricultural metaphor, the idea that there's this soil. I almost think perhaps perhaps Austen wouldn't want to even introduce agricultural metaphors because it would imply that there was some association with manual labor that kind of would be kind of a bit of a no-no. I think there is a little bit of a similarity, although it's definitely stylistically different in the sense that you may recall Darcy's noble mien that everyone kind of looked at and went, oh, he must be a gentleman because he has this noble mien. Hurton's kind of similarly represented in the sense that, as you know, when you go through reading the novel, he's definitely oppressed by social kind of forces, particularly Heathcliff's desire to kind of force him down in the world and degrade him. But nonetheless, he still possesses this physiognomy of a mind owning better qualities than his father ever possessed. I've got this question here. It's a general question. You don't need to know much about Wuthering Heights to answer it. Do we still today kind of continue to hold beliefs about the relationship between beauty and morality, between facial shape and psychological character?
I think it unfortunately is kind of a racial thing as well, which is, unfortunate, but there are lots of connotations between ethnic shaped faces, depending on which ethnicity it is, and the connotations that come to those ethnicities, if that makes sense.
Yes. So you've got a phrenology kind of profile here between someone with eyes that are a little bit more open, and they're described as being sincere, but you also notice the nose is more linear, whereas you have a deceitful looking character and he has a bit of an Abrahamic nose. And during this period, like if you read a lot of Charles Dickens or you read a lot of Victorian novelists and you look at, for instance, depictions of Jewish characters, they're stereotypically depicted as Shylock type characters with kind of miserly little beady eyes and a hooked nose, and they're always hiding away their money. Have we changed in a way? Do we try to look beyond that? So much silence here.
I'd like to think so, but like Amber said, I feel like unfortunately it's just not the case.
No, but we don't. We may stereotype. I think stereotyping is an instinctive behavior, but do we associate ugliness with immorality? As Caitlin's saying no, I think. I don't think we do. I think we've moved beyond that. I think we're aware that we stereotype and we're aware that we may have unconscious biases, but this period they made stereotyping a science. And I'm not suggesting as well that in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights this is the case. I don't think that's the case at all. I think Emily Bronte's fiction's a lot different from Charlotte Bronte's fiction in the terms of in how stereotyping occurs. And anyone, for instance, who looks at Catherine Earnshaw, who's described as the queen of the countryside, she's a very pretty girl. She's also exceptionally violent. She hits people, she smashes their heads with mugs, she shakes babies. There's no actual correlationship between beauty and morality in that respect, which is a bit different when you think back to Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, where you had a character like Jane Bennet, who is exceptionally beautiful. And because she's so beautiful, she's just so morally upright. That kind of seems to have changed. So I think there's a difference between the science of the time and what you're going to actually see in the literature. Does anyone know how I turn this laser off? Oh yes, that's how I turn it off, sorry. I want to say a little bit before we get into a chapter reading. I'm going to talk about kind of a few other aspects of context about Emily's personality, because I I didn't actually mention this when we talked about Jane Austen, but it's actually reading her letters, Jane Austen's letters to her friends during the holiday period. And what really emerges from reading about Jane Austen is that she was a bit of a bitch, to be honest. Like, she was a bit of a nasty, snarky type person. If you were to pick one character out of Pride and Prejudice that she would have been like, it would have been perhaps Mrs. Hurst or Caroline Bingley. She could be very nasty and very spiteful to those around her. Emily was very different from someone like Jane Austen. Basically, what appears from the biography that we have of her, because it's very vague, is that she couldn't really stand people. Unlike her two sisters, Charlotte and Anne, who wanted to work as governesses, who wanted to socialize and be gregarious, Emily really just preferred being alone. She preferred the solitude of the parsonage, the moors, the tombstones, where she kind of had this role as acting as a type of nurse to her father, who was quite a draconian, idiotic figure in the Bronte sisters' lives. But she just liked being left alone. She was definitely a bit of a misanthrope, a bit of a fatalist, and you see that when you read Wuthering Heights. She doesn't really have an incredible amount of faith in human beings. Also, she didn't really have an incredible amount of friends. Although I'll discuss some of the friends she had, some of them are very interesting in not being like well-educated, upstanding people. She often got along better with the farmers in Yorkshire than she did with kind of big, weak intellectual people in her community. What I think this all boils down to is she probably preferred animals, specifically dogs, to human companions. And I think this helps explain the preponderance of animals that you see in Wuthering Heights, particularly dogs, because there's just dogs all throughout the novel. I've got a description here from Charlotte Bronte, who, after Emily died and after the Bronte sisters became somewhat famous, had to write a preface or an explanation as to why Wuthering Heights is such a strange novel. And people in the public wanted to know something about the author of Wuthering Heights. And she wrote, "My sister's disposition was not naturally gregarious. Circumstances favoured and fostered her tendency to seclusion. Except to go to church or to take a walk on the hills, she rarely crossed the threshold of home. Though her feeling for the people round her was benevolent, intercourse with them was never sought, nor with very few exceptions ever experienced." Does this sound like kind of a bit of a solitary figure?
Yeah, definitely. Like a bit of a homebody sort of thing.
What's a homebody? Was that you, Olivia?
Yeah. Someone who likes to stay at home, doesn't really like to leave the house kind of thing.
That's a really interesting point, because Emily Bronte certainly wasn't agoraphobic because she loved the moors, but she clearly liked avoiding people. She didn't really like the hassle of dealing with people, which I do kind of think you find a little bit in Wuthering Heights. There is kind of another aspect to Emily that kind of often got kind of put to the side. And Janie Kennard, in a really interesting article, a queer reading of Wuthering Heights, that actually suggests that Heathcliff actually represents the masculine aspects to Emily Bronte's personality, suggests that she wasn't such a loner as they say. She actually preferred kind of hanging around with all the agricultural figures in her community. So Emily Bronte is often kind of portrayed as a bit of a tomboy. People describe her as having a singular masculine bent of intellect, comparing her sister. Emily Bronte's mind was by far the more masculine of the two. Emily was also very much a Catherine Heathcliff. Other historians say that she clearly knew the boy in herself and later knew the man. Others knew it too. Others, particularly the Haworth villagers, the people in her community, said that she was very much like a boy more than a girl, and a boy who worked at the parsonage kind of described her as a boy, as opposed to being very feminine. Kind of repeated descriptions of Emily kind of emphasized the fact that she was very masculine as opposed to being very feminine. A lot of the descriptions are of kind of Emily out and about, kind of not quite in trousers, but kind of close to it, getting out and about with her dogs, whom she would whistle to in a masculine fashion. When she went to Belgium to be educated by a guy called Constant Heger, he described her that she should have been a man, a great navigator. People in her community often called her the Major because kind of her masculine attributes. So even though she was a bit of a loner, people have often described her as a bit of a tomboy as well. I think this is important, and I'm going somewhere with this is because we kind of, when we move away from Pride and Prejudice and enter into the Victorian period, this was the period that kind of started to think more publicly about social questions to do with the position of women in society. This was known as the woman question. This is what it was called. If you read a lot of historical articles, newspaper articles, you'll often find particularly older men kind of debating about the woman question, which was a question about what is to be done with women in society. Because I mentioned before that Emily Bronte kind of and her sisters wanted to go into teaching because that was one of the only places that they could actually kind of have some career or professional role. Another one that would become available was nursing, when Florence Nightingale in the 1860s really promoted the role of nursing, but most middle class women kind of couldn't really go anywhere. And we kind of saw that with Pride and Prejudice. Interestingly, often we like to think of history going in a progressive fashion. The Victorian period for women, things kind of in a way became worse. It saw a polarization in gender norms. Middle class women particularly found them excluded from professions and sequestered to the home, to this space particularly known as the parlour, which I don't think we have anymore. But when you read Wuthering Heights and you particularly look at the Grange is kind of constituted as this, has this very feminine space known as the parlour, where women are kind of supposed to have kind of domestic power over that little area. If you actually look at Wuthering Heights, the house, there is no parlour. It's very much a democratic, open, often violent kind of place surrounded by a fire. So what I mean by kind of things becoming less progressive for women during this period, if you think about the Industrial Revolution that occurred from around 1760 all the way up into the 1850s, it created tremendous opportunities for women, particularly working and lower middle class women. Suddenly they all found that they could work in factories, which you might think is bad in a way, but they could get money. And by getting money, they could get some semblance of freedom, particularly from kind of traditional nuclear families. And this happened particularly in the 1810s and 1820s. A lot of women just said, I'm not getting married. I'm just going to keep my wages and have a little apartment somewhere, and I'll just live by myself, and this will be great. What actually happened during the Victorian period is specific forms of legislation, such as the Factories Act of 1837 and the Mines Act of 1842, basically forbade women from working a certain amount of hours, and kind of suggested or implied culturally that women shouldn't really be working at all in these new industrial settings, that men should be working, which is interesting to note, I think, because we often think that history kind of progresses. But what kind of happened during this period is there was this new form of patriarchy that emerged called an industrial patriarchy, in which basically wealthy factory-owning men had a social contract with poorer working class men that said, you give us your labor time and we'll make sure that women can't work with you, so your work's not gendered and you're not feminized. Working in a factory can be very dehumanizing, but what we'll also give you is this domestic space known as the parlor. So you can come home and there'll be this angel in the house. That's what women were called, who kind of controlled the domestic sphere during this period, and she'll look after you and kind of care for you. A lot of Victorian literature, and I think Wuthering Wuthering Heights, to a certain extent, refers to this, particularly in Isabella Linton's representation after she marries Heathcliff, and the way she's kind of abused in this domestic setting at Wuthering Heights, and how it kind of contrasts drastically from the Grange. A lot of women's literature during the Victorian period sought to really attack this woman question issue by suggesting that women need more career opportunities than just either governessing or nothing. It's also worthwhile noting that a lot of literature during this period, we often like to think that literature is this progressive thing, but it also became a significant forum for anti-feminist sentiment. So a lot of the literature, particularly of Charles Dickens, if you look at the representations of femininity, Hard Times, Bleak House, and Little Dorrit are kind of published around the same time or a little after Wuthering Heights comes out. They're very much anti-feminist novels in the sense that women are depicted as these pillows, basically, that exist solely to service kind of fraught and tired masculinity, particularly in Hard Times. If anyone's kind of read the novel or had to read it in high school, there's a character called Sissy Jupe, and it's so absurd. She basically just walks around looking for a man to give a massage after a hard day's work. I think it's important to mention this context because if we look at the two options that the Bronte sisters had, on the one hand, they had the opportunity of teaching, kind of because they weren't considered to be very attractive by conventional standards. They were educated by their father to kind of be able to go out and to teach and to have some form of kind of career, but that was kind of it. I might ask kind of what else could have they done? Middle-class women, kind of the same background as Jane Austen, what other avenues could they have to make money? Silence, deadening. Have I put you all to sleep? Is there perhaps
Someone said in
think
the
about
chat
what
nursing.
nursing? Yeah, nursing came about a bit later. It's self-evident. It's staring you in the face.
School teacher.
No, not that self-evident. I'm sorry, I shouldn't really be kind of asking you questions and expecting you to know the answers. Remember when I finished talking about Jane Austen last week, and I said the reason why Jane Austen is important in a way is because she established the novel as a space that women could occupy. So Jane Austen actually made a lot of money from writing her novels. So she established literature as this space that women could go into and make money from it. So one area kind of the Bronte sisters could go into, one of the only other areas, is writing. When Jane Eyre was published, Charlotte Bronte got £100 for the publication for the publication rights to Jane Eyre, and that's a lot of money. So even though kind of there were limited opportunity structures, growing up, the sisters had a lot of access to literature. They were also kind of writing and being creative growing up. So they did actually have this opportunity to write, and kind of that's really kind of how they kind of basically kind of thought about how can we get out of this predicament? Well, we'll write bestsellers. So in terms of the publication context of Wuthering Heights, in 1846, Charlotte, who was a very nosy sister, I don't know, does anyone have a sister who's a bit nosy? Or a brother?
Sister.
Goes through a sister?
Yeah.
How so? India, what does she do? Does she ever go through your stuff?
She's just always wanting to know what I'm doing. Every day I get a phone call and she's like, what are you doing today? Like, tell me all the details. And I'm like, dude, I don't want to talk to you.
Is this your younger sister?
No, she's older than me.
Ah, she's older.
Yeah, but she's moved out. So she's just very much, and she's over here nearly every night.
I see. Well, similar to that, I think Charlotte was like going through all of Emily's stuff, and she discovered like a book full of Emily's poetry. And she thought, geez, this poetry is really good. We ought to get it published. So they set out this plan. Emily didn't want to get published. She didn't want to she never wanted fame or anything. Charlotte clearly did, and Anne kind of just followed along. So they set out to write kind of a book of poetry. They gave themselves male pseudonyms, Currer, Alice, and Acton. Currer, the C for Charlotte, Alice, the E for Emily, Acton, the A for Anne. They paid to get it published. Only 2 copies sold. So it was a bit of a disaster. But they loved the experience, and they thought, you know what, teaching may not be kind of a good thing, but I do think we can actually make money from publishing novels. So they kind of set out to kind of, let's write some novels and see if we can get them published. And that's exactly what they did. In 1847, Anne's Agnes Grey. I don't know if anyone's read Agnes Grey. It's kind of the least read, perhaps, of all the Bronte sisters' works. It's actually my favorite. And Emily's Wuthering Heights were kind of published together. Charlotte's The Professor, which is an incredibly bad novel, but it got published eventually because it's Charlotte Bronte. That kept getting rejected. In the same year, in 1847, kind of Charlotte, she was getting so much rejections for The Professor, she thought, I might try a new one, and she kind of wrote Jane Eyre, which became an instant bestseller. What happened with Wuthering Heights, though, is it didn't work too well at all. Has anyone read either Jane Eyre or The Tenant of Redfield Hall or Agnes Grey? No, says Olivia. After reading Wuthering Heights, those of you who have kind of chugged through it, do you think you'll check out any other? Camille, do you think you'll check out any other Bronte novels?
Yeah, I'll give it a go.
I
Which
definitely
one
would
you recommend.
If you want a shorter read, try Agnes Grey. But if you want a really great read, try Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is described as one of the greatest novels ever written. It's definitely a page turner. It's definitely it's a work of profound genius. So it's definitely worth reading. It's not as challenging as Wuthering Heights. So I definitely recommend to all of you, if you have the time, to read Jane Eyre, because it definitely rewards you reading it. It will definitely stimulate you to read more. I've got a few more slides, and then we're going to do a reading from Wuthering Heights. And the way I want to set up this reading is Wuthering Heights is a very violent novel, and it was written during the 1840s. This was a period known as the Hungry 40s. The Brontes were most active during this period, during the early Victorian period. What made the Hungry 40s so horrible is you had a whole bunch of legislation created earlier in the century that really set up an environment for people to kind of suffer drastically. To think, although it's not in any way similar, if you look at, for instance, negative gearing and the various legislation that's been put in place by successive Liberal governments that's basically made housing prices so unaffordable. At the beginning of the 19th century, you had a very conservative government set up what was known as the Corn Laws, which basically banned or put a huge tax on any grain that was imported into Great Britain, which meant that food was much more expensive. In the 1830s, you had this thing called the Great Reform Act, which gave the right to vote to certain men who are of a certain economic standing, but forbade the right to vote to women, whether they were educated or not, didn't really matter, but to working class women and working class men as well. After this act was passed, you had what was called the New Poor Law Act of 1834, which basically penalized anyone that would go to their local council or their, what's the equivalent of today's Centrelink, and ask for some poor relief, ask for some social security. If you went to them, they would put you in what was called the poorhouse, and you would be locked up in there until you could get out and support yourself financially. So a lot of people didn't want to go and seek social services. The Hungry 40s were also called the Hungry 40s because it coincided with the Irish potato famine, when there was this bacterial infestation of potatoes, Phytophthora infestans, which basically blighted all of the potato crops in Ireland and a little bit of Britain, and led to mass famine in Ireland, but also internal migration across to the Americas, but also internal migration to Britain from Ireland. So there was a whole lot of horrible legislation occurring early in the 19th century to really set up the 1840s to be a horrible period to be alive. And I think you do see that to a certain extent, although Wuthering Heights is a historical romance. It's set kind of beginning in the 1750s and going all the way up to 1802. It nonetheless kind of speaks to kind of the want and the starvation of the 1840s. And you might see this when it comes to the genesis of Heathcliff, where Heathcliff comes from. I'll read you a passage now from an account of Heathcliff's origins. How do we find Heathcliff? Where does he come from in Wuthering Heights? Does anyone know where he comes from? I might ask Caitlin, do you reckon you could read this passage? Yeah, I'm just tired of hearing myself. Thank you. That was a great hearty reading as well, Caitlin. What kind of ethnicity is Heathcliff? Is this clear at all? Like, where's he come from?
I mean, the only real thing you get is the streets of Liverpool.
The streets of Liverpool. Yep.
That's not got much to do with like his ethnicity or like his actual background, anything like that. Just that he's on the streets.
He's been found in the gutter, basically. Liverpool kind of could be significant because it kind of was associated with migration from Ireland to Britain during the Hungry 40s. But if we go back to the beginning of this novel, slavery is still in operation, and Liverpool was a major trading port for slaves during this period. So he may be this kind of, he could be the offspring of a slave or a slave runaway. It's just not explicitly stated. Is there any idea that kind of Heathcliff isn't English or British?
Yeah, I was just going to mention him being called a gypsy. Like we tend to associate that with like a type of person, but in Ireland, it's actually a cultural group. I think it's like almost their native, like
Mm,
their version of native people, I guess. Sometimes called Irish travellers. So
yes.
yeah, maybe that's him. Maybe that's what they're referring to there.
It's interesting because we'll read a passage in a moment where gypsy comes up again. And yeah, you do have Romani gypsies, but then you have Geordies as well. The kind of semi-Irish, kind of the more northern Western European gypsies that move around kind of that area as well. Does Heathcliff speak English?
It seems not at first with that gibberish. Maybe he didn't.
And repeated over and over again some gibberish that no one could understand. So Heathcliff has language, but he's just repeating some gibberish. It's very interesting when you read Wuthering Heights to try to figure out where Heathcliff comes from, what color he is, because he'll become this kind of polymorphic kind of little creature that has so many attributes. Does anyone just listening to Caitlin's wonderful reading of this passage think this is very different from Pride and Prejudice?
Yeah, it seems a bit more easy to follow, to be honest.
Oh yeah, yeah. Olivia, like it's a very beautiful and clear and well-written novel, Wuthering Heights, to read. I do think the little gypsy brat wouldn't have made it into the Netherfield Bull or anywhere near Longbourn. Someone would have stopped the gypsy brat like long ago from getting anywhere near that. I want to kind of do one reading and then have a break because we've been going for an hour and a half now. Similar to our reading of Pride and Prejudice, I'm hoping we can get some readers to read a passage. And this is a passage kind of continuing to describe and look at the way Heathcliff's represented and also the context of kind of the Hungry 40s in which this novel was composed. I'm hoping I can get some volunteers to play some characters. And I'm thinking, I've got them color-coded again. I'm hoping, Caitlin, you might like to continue on as Nellie. Thank you, that'd be great. I'll play Heathcliff, unless someone wants to play Heathcliff. Does anyone want to play Heathcliff? It'll be fun. It's Heathcliff the child. Sarisha, you will have one line, just one line. Do you think you could play Catherine?
Sure.
Sure. Catherine will be grey. Hey, Dana, do you reckon you could play Isabella Linton?
Yep.
Great. That's blue. I know. I'm just checking because, you know, sometimes people forget their colors. You'll be light blue. You don't have too many lines, but a few. You've got to play a little snobby child. She's very precious. Who else can I ask? Jamie, do you think you could play Mrs. Linton?
Yeah, sure.
Mrs. Linton's very snobby and she gets horrified when she sees Olivia. I'm going to ask, where'd you go, Lachlan? Where are you? You're still here, aren't you? Or did you run away? Did Lachlan go? Damn it, Lachlan's ran away. Why'd you run away, Lachlan? I'm going to have to call upon Ethan again. Can you play Robert?
Yeah, sure.
Robert, to give you some character, he's a servant. So maybe play a little bit lower down in the social echelon if you can. Who have we got? We've got Sarisha as Catherine, me as Heathcliff, Caitlin as Nellie. We've got an Edgar Linton, have we? No, we don't have an Edgar Linton. Jamie, have you agreed to play someone? You have, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah, I'm Mrs. Linton.
Melinda, could you play someone?
Yeah, sure.
Could you play Edgar Linton? You'll be Pink.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's everyone. we're ready to go. All right, let's do it. Can you start us off, Caitlin? You'll be Nally, who will be in black. Yeah, but don't worry, Nally's work, she'll disappear in a moment. At Thrushcross Grange, and I would have been there too, but they had not the manners to ask me to stay. Let me get off my wet clothes and I'll tell you all about it, Nally. Kathy and I escaped from the wash house to have a ramble at Liberty, and getting a glimpse of the Grange lights, we thought we would just go and see whether the Lintons passed their Sunday evenings standing shivering in corners while their father and mother sat eating and drinking and singing and laughing and burning their eyes out before the fire. Do you think they do? Or reading sermons and being catechized by their manservant and set to learn a column of scripture names if they don't answer properly? Don't can't, Nally. Nonsense. We ran from the top of the heights to the park without stopping. Catherine completely beaten in the race because she was barefoot. You'll have to seek for her shoes in the bog tomorrow. We crept through a broken hedge, groped our way up the path, and planted ourselves on a flower pot under the drawing room window. The light came from thence. They had not put up the shutters, and the curtains were only half closed. Both of us were able to look in by standing on the basement and clinging to the ledge, and we saw, it was beautiful. A splendid place carpeted with crimson and crimson-covered chairs and tables, and a pure white ceiling bordered by gold, a shower of glass drops hanging in silver chains from the center and shimmering with little soft tapers. Old Mr. and Mrs. Linton were not there. Edgar and his sister had it entirely to themselves. Shouldn't they have been happy? We should have thought ourselves in heaven. And now, guess what your good children were doing? Isabella, I believe she is 11, a year younger than Kathy, lay screaming at the farther end of the room, shrieking as if witches were running red-hot needles into her. Edgar stood on the other hearth, weeping silently, and in the middle of the table sat a little dog, shaking its paw and yelping, which from their mutual accusations we understood they had nearly pulled in two between them. The idiots! That was their pleasure, to quarrel who should hold a heap of warm hair, and each begin to cry because both, after struggling to get it, refused to take it. We laughed outright at the petted things. We despised them. When would you catch me wishing to have what Catherine wanted, or find us by ourselves seeking entertainment and yelling and sobbing and rolling on the ground, divided by the whole room? I'd not exchange for 1,000 lives my condition here for Edgar Linton's at Thrushcross Grange, not if I might have the privilege of flinging Joseph off the highest gable and painting the house front with Hindley's blood. I told you we laughed. The Lintons heard us, and with one accord they shot like arrows to the door. There was silence, and then a cry.
Oh, Mama, Mama.
Oh, Papa. Oh, Mama, come here.
Oh, Papa. Oh.
They really did howl out something in that way. We made frightful noises to terrify them still more. And then we dropped off the ledge because somebody was drawing the bars and we felt we had better flee. I had Kathy by the hand and was urging her on when all at once she fell down.
Run, Heathcliff, run. They have left the bulldogs loose and he holds me.
The devil had seized her ankle. Nally, I heard his abominable snorting. She did not yell out. No, she would have scorned to do it if she had been spitted on the horns of a mad cow. I did, though. I vociferated curses enough to annihilate any fiend in Christendom. And I got a stone and thrust it between his jaws and tried with all my might to cram it down his throat. A beast of a servant came up with a lantern at last, shouting,
"Keep fast, Skulker, keep fast."
He changed his note, however, when he saw Skulker's game. The dog was throttled off, his huge purple tongue hanging half a foot out of his mouth and his pendant lips streaming with bloody slaver. The man took Kathy up. She was sick, not from fear, I'm certain, but from pain. He carried her in. I followed, grumbling execrations and vengeance. Oh no, who's our Mr. Linton? What, pray, Robert?
Skulker has caught a little girl, sir, and there's a lad here who looks an outer. Very like the robbers were for putting them through the window to open the doors to the gang after all were asleep, that they might murder us at their ease. Hold your tongue, you foul-mouthed thief. You shall go to the gallows for this. Mr. Linton, sir, don't lay by your gun.
No, no, Robert, said the old fool. The rascals knew that yesterday was my red day. They thought to have me cleverly. Come in, I'll furnish them a reception. There, John, fasten the chain. Give Skulker some water. Jenny, to beard a magistrate in his stronghold, and on the Sabbath too. Where will their insolence stop? Oh, my dear Mary, look here. Don't be afraid, it is but a boy, yet the villain scowls so plainly in his face. Would it not be a kindness to the country to hang him at once before he shows his nature in acts as well as features? He pulled me under the chandelier, and Mrs. Linton placed her spectacles on her nose and raised her hands in horror. The cowardly children crept nearer also.
Frightful thing. Put him in the cellar, Papa. He's exactly like the son of the fortune teller that stole my tame pheasant. Isn't he, Edgar?
While they examined me, Kathy came round. She heard the last speech and laughed. Edgar Linton, after an inquisitive stare, collected sufficient wit to recognize her. They see us at church, you know, though we seldom meet them elsewhere.
That's Miss Earnshaw, and look how Sulka has bitten her, how her foot bleeds.
Miss Earnshaw? Nonsense. Miss Earnshaw scouring the country with a gypsy? And yet, my dear, the child is in mourning. Surely it is, and she may be lamed for life.
What culpable carelessness in her brother! I've understood from Shielder the curate that he let her grow up in absolute heathenism. But who is this? Where did she pick up this companion? Oh ho, I declare he is that strange acquisition my late neighbour made in his journey to Liverpool, a little Lascar or an American or Spanish castaway.
A wicked boy at all events, and quite unfit for a decent house. Did you notice his language, Linton? I'm shocked that my children should have heard it.
I recommend cursing. Don't be angry, Nellie. And so Robert was ordered to take me off. I refused to go without Kathy. He dragged me into the garden, pushed a lantern into my hand, assured me that Mr. Earnshaw would be informed of my behaviour, and bidding me march directly, secured the door again. The curtains were still looped at one corner, and I resumed my station as spy, because if Catherine had wished to return, I intended shattering their great glass panes to a million of fragments, unless they let her out. She sat on the sofa quietly. Miss Linton took off the great grey cloak of the dairymaid which had borrowed for our excursion, shaking her head and expostulating with her. I suppose she was a young lady, and they made a distinction between her treatment and mine. Then the woman servant brought a basin of warm water and washed her feet, and Mr. Linton mixed a tumbler of negus, and Isabella emptied a plateful of cakes into her lap, and Edgar stood gaping at a distance. Afterward, they dried and combed her beautiful hair and gave her a pair of enormous slippers and wheeled her to the fire, and I left her, as merry as she could be, dividing her food between the little dog and Skulker, whose nose she pinched as he ate, and kindling a spark of spirit in the vacant blue eyes of the Lintons, a dim reflection from her own enchanting face. I saw they were full of stupid admiration. She is so immeasurably superior to them, to everybody on earth. Is she not, Nellie? Whew. Thanks, everyone. Some clapping there. It was a bit of an epic read. So what's going on in this scene? What do the Lintons fear Catherine and Heathcliff are up to? We're thinking about a period of grave kind of economic depression. Are they mistaken for someone or a group?
Were the Lintons robbed like before this event?
I don't think they were, but I think you're on the right path, Camille. I think they think that Catherine, but particularly Heathcliff, are planning to rob them and kind of steal all their belongings. Carrying on from our first description of Heathcliff's origin in the story, what ethnicity is Heathcliff described as here? If we go back here, a little Lascar or an American or Spanish castaway. Keep going back, Robert, he describes Heathcliff as he looked an out and outer. Is that a term we would use today at all?
I've never heard of it, so probably not.
No. Is it understandable, or do we need to get the dictionary out? Like, he looked an out and outer.
Like an out-of-towner kind of thing?
Yeah, maybe an out and outer. Any other thoughts on what an out and outer? There's no answer, I don't think. Well, I've got an impression of what I think an out and outer would be. I don't think it's an ethnic slur. I think it's an out and outer. Is that like an exceedingly bad looking person?
Yeah, it could be. It could also be like, on the outskirts of what's acceptably like good looking or acceptable for the society.
And he's also, as you would have noticed, Camille, because you mentioned before, he's represented as a gypsy again.
Yeah,
but
that's
he's also
interesting.
but he's also represented as a little Lascar. What on earth? Did anyone look up Lascar when they were reading this? I think Alaska is like an Arab ship boy of some sort, an American or Spanish castaway. So Heathcliff's kind of getting represented in multiple ways. What do they propose doing, or Mr. Linton in particular? What do they plan to do to Heathcliff, or what do they think would be best to do to him? I don't think it exists today, what they plan to do, but it was very common during this period. Particularly if you read a lot of Charles Dickens fiction, it kind of often forms a common thread. And we'll actually see it happen to one of our characters in one of the novels we read, the main protagonist.
They send him to the gallows, which means to be hung.
Yeah,
They want to be
Mr. Linton says this guy looks so criminal, it would be, a service to the community to hang him before he does anything kind of evil. So this was a very grim period where you could get hung for very simple things. I mean, a lot of the early convicts in Australia they were either hung or kind of had their hanging commuted and they were sent out here. Final question before we take a break. Why do you think Heathcliff is treated so very differently? Why do they make a distinction between Heathcliff and Cathy?
Is it because he's a boy, or is it because of his race?
I don't know. Any other thoughts? Extending from Jamie's suggestion, because Jamie's suggestion was a question as well.
I was kind of not sure about this too, because they're from the same family. So I wondered why they were treated so different, but perhaps maybe it's to do with Heathcliff's appearance, and maybe he's dressed or presented poorly compared to Catherine.
Yeah, that's a good point, Camille, because when Hindley returns and takes over the house after the senior Earnshaw dies and he starts tyrannizing Heathcliff, he does get oppressed and kind of made to be more degraded. So that could be an aspect there. I think it's a combination of multiple factors. The fact that he's ethnically different looking, he's definitely kind of dressed weirdly, but he just looks suspicious. He looks a bit criminal, whereas Catherine can be placed. And we'll see this throughout the novel as we come to read it, particularly Heathcliff's kind of stereotyped as being ethnic and being evil at the same time. And Catherine kind of undergoes a transformation and becomes more feminine, more white, and more cultured in that sense. But I think we'll have a break now because we've been going for 2 hours. So let's have a quick break. It's 7:54. Can we have a 10-minute break? And when we reconvene, we'll talk about aspects of romance and realism in the second half of this session. So I'll just chuck in the chat, 10-minute break, and I'll get the numerics right. Bloody, what's his name? Disappeared. Anyway. Back at 8:05. I'm just going to get a cup of tea, but if you've got questions, I'll be back in a couple more minutes. That's right. Things add to my dishevelment. Well, I wonder if there's any. No. Just going through the chat. I don't know if you're there, Camille. I'm just reading
Yeah,
the
I'm here.
chat. Was Wuthering Heights published under Bronte's real name? No. It was published under Cara Bell. No, sorry. Alice Bell. And everyone thought, because there's a thing during the period where they try to guess, because a lot of men wrote under pseudonyms as well, but most women had to write under pseudonyms. And I can't remember if I mentioned, I should have, I think I did, Pride and Prejudice, all of Jane Austen's novels weren't written under her name. I think some of them were written by a lady that was on the title page, like a novel by a lady. But there was no by Jane Austen until after she died, when kind of then it became okay. But Wuthering Heights was published under a pseudonym as well. So was Jane Eyre. So was all of their novels. But out of all of them, everyone thought that Wuthering Heights was written by a very aggressive man. Because of the violence, they just couldn't conceive that a woman would write a novel that violent.
Interesting. I wonder. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you were going to wonder something, which is probably interesting, more interesting than what I was.
Debatable. I was wondering if they chose the surname Bell, maybe to connect to that they weren't Bells, you know. Like it was almost that opposite. I know it's not the same spelling, but maybe they were making a comment or somewhat.
Yeah, well, they're it's not. Oh, well, they're kind of. Yeah, it could be. I actually think there is actually a reason why they use Bell. It slips my mind right now, but there actually was a reason why they chose Bell. I think they liked the name because it sounded kind of somewhat poetic. But there may actually be more to it than that. I know, for instance, a contemporary of theirs, Mary Ann Evans, who went by the writer's name of George Eliot, she chose George Eliot because the name sounded kind of more masculine and kind of mature and serious. So kind of that's why she chose that title. Actually, I think she also chose it for another reason as well. Usually they chose their names kind of particularly kind of with a view in mind. I don't mind their names, like the pseudonyms, they're somewhat nice.
Yeah, I like that they kept their initial.
I hate the little tittle on the E of Bronte. That's so very annoying to kind of, like whenever you're writing like something, an essay or something, to have to put in that E every time. And you know the double little diacritic mark over the E I'm talking about? On the,
yeah, I think so.
On their last name, yeah. They never had that. Their father put it there to give them more of a kind of aristocratic kind of look. But it's
like that.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a very frustrating piece of grammar, because if you ever write anything about the Brontes, you've got to, I don't know, you can do a control find and a control replace, I guess, but sometimes you miss stuff. That sometimes happens. But yeah, I definitely
typing on it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you were about to tell me how to do it, right?
Yeah, if you're typing on a Mac, if you just hold down the letter E, then it comes
Yep.
up with all the options, and then you just
Ah,
the
that's a
number,
Mac,
whatever.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. They should have that on PC where you just hold it down and it comes up.
Yeah, definitely.
No, I definitely recommend Jane Eyre if you continue on reading from this period. It's similar but very different.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out.
Agnes Grey is good as well, but it's not as extreme as either Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. I prefer Agnes Grey because it's like a novel. Once you've read it 5 or 6 times, you can just, it's one of those go-to novels that you can just read and it's pleasurable. It's not very it's not challenging, it's just comfortable. Olivia's written in the chat, Nellie is one of my best friends' names, so it's so weird to hear her name so much as it isn't a very common name, is it, Olivia?
No, it's not. And it's spelt the same too. It's usually spelt Nellie, but it's spelt the exact same. So it's really weird.
It's also weird in the sense that Nellie's not her real name, I don't think. It's Alan Dean. But everyone takes to calling her Nellie in the novel, which I don't know why they do it. They just do it.
Weird. Well, my Nellie's name is Nellie.
Maybe, do you know why she got named Nellie?
No, I don't. Her brother and her sister's names don't have, I mean, William's her brother, but he goes by Will, and Eva's her sister. So they're not really like old-fashioned names like Nellie, so I'm not sure.
No. Yeah, my parents were going to call me George, and I'm very glad they didn't. Having said that, I wouldn't have minded George because there's so many Chris's out there. I remember once I went to some class and there was like 8 Chris's in the class. It was, yeah. You guys have all got pretty interesting names. Like, they're all kind of very ornate names. Clara's a really nice name. All your names are nice, but Clara's a nice kind of sounding name. You don't come across many Claras. And Soleil, you've got a really wonderful name. Everyone's got nice names. Olivia's a nice name. Shania's a nice name. I hate complimenting people on their names because if you miss out on people's name, they're like, oh, what do you mean? Inja's not a good name? How dare you? How dare you? Caitlin's good as well. Sarisha's really good as well. We all have wonderful names. Melinda's a great name. Alana's a great name. Let's get back into it because we've got a little bit more to cover and then I can let you go and you can, bearing in mind, like what I mentioned at the start, some of you may not be reading Wuthering Heights. You've decided I'm going to jump ahead and read Tess of the D'Urbervilles or Lady Chatterley's Lover. That's great, but let's return to. I want to talk in the remainder of time we've got about aspects of romance and aspects of realism in Wuthering Heights because that should be helpful. So let's get the ball rolling again. So you guys all seeing Heathcliff and Kathy running in the malls? Back to my PowerPoint. Sorry guys, I know I'm PowerPointing you to death, but let's get through a few more slides and do one more reading. And we're going to have a discussion about passion and violence, love in Pride and Prejudice and Wuthering Heights. But as Camille was mentioning, the narrative structure is very different compared to Pride and Prejudice. I think Camille was also mentioning, if I zoom forward, more to do with the mode of narration. But Wuthering Heights is an intergenerational novel. So it's basically 2 books. The first book tells the story of the first Earnshaw Lindley generation, and the second book tells the story of the second Linton Earnshaw generation. So it can come across as a bit complex in that respect, but kind of they're all connected except for Heathcliff, who's kind of excluded on the periphery. This is very different in terms of narrative compared to Pride and Prejudice, which is set over the course of a year. It's also very temporally sophisticated when it comes to the way it works with time. Kind of time is structured quite well. In terms of realism and why this novel is perhaps more appealing to the reader is that the mode of narration in Wuthering Heights is first-person narrative perspective. Did anyone remember that strategy of representation? This may be on the quiz. So if you get this right, you may get a quiz question right. And does anyone remember that style of narration that I mentioned that Jane Austen pioneered and kind of excelled in?
The non-direct something?
Oh, almost. You're almost there. I know you know it, Melinda, and I think Caitlin's kind of thinking she knows it. Anyone else? Kind of, you're in the right area, where the narrator's perspective gets blurred with the characters. Some of you probably know, and you're all like, I'm not going to tell them, so they'll get their quiz wrong and I get my quiz right. That's how I win in this world. Is that true?
Here you go, guys. It's free indirect discourse.
Free indirect discourse. That's it. Free indirect discourse. That will be on the quiz. Haha. You 13 members are going to get that quiz question right. I don't think there's any free indirect discourse in this narrative, but there is most of it, nearly all of it, sorry, is told from the first person perspective, from I. I did this, I did that. We saw that when we did that reading. Heathcliff tells about how Catherine and him went for this run across the moors and what they saw. I saw this, I saw that. The dog attacked her. I didn't like the dog attacking her. I swore at them. First person creates immediacy, but it also generates forms of identification or forms of disidentification with characters. Ask yourself this. What would it have been like to get a perspective into Wickham's mind? Do we get that in Pride and Prejudice? George Wickham, the nefarious lying character. Would it maybe make us sympathize with him a little bit, or would it just enhance our evilness because we'd see him plotting all the time?
I think sympathize, because then you could see kind of where he's coming from.
Yeah, I do kind of think that if Austen had have given us a bit of first-person perspective, if she had entered into his perspective, maybe we would have seen the constraints placed on Wickham's character. Although first-person narrative's not kind of considered radical, it is quite radical in Wuthering Heights because a servant is telling the story. And I have to say, those of you kind of who have read some of it and are going to read it all, pay attention to Nally, Olivia, not just your friend, Nally Dean, because she often is the smartest character in the novel, and she often causes things to happen. She often tells Heathcliff, for instance, "You're so tough, Heathcliff. You could knock Edgar Linton down with a blow," and lo and behold, that tends to be what happens. Nally often kind of causes things to happen. She often kind of causes people to die as well. Recall in Pride and Prejudice, the servants kind of just exist to serve. They have no real agency. That's why Wuthering Heights is somewhat radical and somewhat democratic in a way, because you have a servant telling the entirety of most of the story. And she's not just a foolish servant, she's quite an intelligent servant. She's an admirable character. She actually probably is the moral center of Wuthering Heights. If you think about Pride and Prejudice and Elizabeth Bennet perhaps being the moral center of the novel, Nally's probably the moral center of Wuthering Heights. Part of the complexity, and if anyone's read Frankenstein or a few other novels that use framing devices, part of the complexity and the beauty of Wuthering Heights is that it's framed in such a way that you get stories within stories. So the narrative's told from the perspective of Lockwood, an outsider who comes into Wuthering Heights. He kind of gets sick, has a discussion with Alan Dean and wants to know about why is Heathcliff such a toxic dude? What's wrong with him? And then Alan goes, oh, it's a cuckoo story. I'll tell you all about that guy. And then she tells the story and you're kind of trapped in there. A framing device is something we're kind of familiar with. Has anyone read Frankenstein or any other kind of novel that has stories within stories? I think you will come across them in your time. Maybe I'll put this on the quiz as well, but I'm not sure. Framing devices are really good ways of trapping the reader in a world. So definitely worth using yourself as if you're a writer. Let's talk about some elements of romance and some elements of realism. Note that on Wednesday, we'll be looking at Wuthering Heights and the Gothic, and we'll be looking at the sublime and certain aspects to do with the Gothic and Gothic realism then. So I won't really touch upon that now. There's definitely a lot of romance in Wuthering Heights. But Heathcliff, is he very different from I know kind of some of you may not have got through the novel yet, but from what you know of Heathcliff, is he a very different character than Mr. Darcy? Why? What's he, you know, is he endearing? Because a lot of students... No, go. No, go, Caitlin. You know. Mm. He's disagreeable. Camille's laughing. I do want to ask those of you who've kind of gotten into Wuthering Heights, is Heathcliff at all kind of endearing or romantic in the kind of in a way that kind of Darcy isn't? Or is he just morally reprehensible and deserves no love by the end of the novel? Yeah, go for it. I think so. Mm, mm. Yeah, I think that's what I think is more interesting to Wuthering Heights as opposed to Pride and Prejudice, in the sense that you have this contradictory character. On the one hand, he does have some very endearing attributes. Heathcliff kind of, it's a bit of a stereotype, but he's this character that's kind of being driven crazy by kind of being rejected and seeks to kind of spoil everyone around him because of that. But nonetheless, the sole kind of thing that drives him is this longing to get back to the person he loved, and he'll do anything for that. If you guys think of Meatloaf's song, I'll do anything for love, but I won't do that. Heathcliff would do everything for love, and he probably would do that. Love is represented kind of not, it's a similar type of romantic love, but it's kind of represented as a transcendental absolute. It's kind of beyond kind of all the physical, mental, temporal kind of boundaries that you have established in Wuthering Heights. And if you kind of continue reading the novel, look for fences and walls and doors and things, because you'll often see them just getting knocked down. So romance is definitely there, but it's a different type of love. Some ways it's very toxic, but some ways it's kind of very pure. Wuthering Heights is also, when we're thinking about elements of romance, it's very ritualistic or very mythic, in the sense that environments and architecture work to personify states of mind. So I'm thinking here about the malls and the heights being very mythical spaces. Did anyone think that, from what they know about the Grange and Wuthering Heights, that they're also gendered spaces or oppositions in terms of civilization and barbarism?
Definitely, there seems to be like a very different setting at each place. One's rather nice and one's rather horrible.
Oh, really? So you prefer to hang out at the Grange, Camille, I imagine?
Yeah, that would probably be my preference.
India.
Hey, Chris, I'm really sorry. I have to leave early tonight. So I'm just gonna
That's fine.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Thanks for telling me. Whereas everyone just absquatulates.
All right.
So
Thanks for having me. It's been good.
no worries. See ya. Why wouldn't you like to live at Wuthering Heights? I actually would prefer Wuthering Heights myself.
I guess I'm just thinking back to that description that Heathcliff gave of it, with the beautiful lights and the crimson cushions and curtains and stuff. It just seems very beautiful. And in my memory of the description of Wuthering Heights, it's more like cold and dark. But
yes, it's one of them is presented as being very barbarous and somewhat savage. It's dark, but they do have that blazing fire, and they all have that food. To defend Wuthering Heights would be to say it's strangely very democratic, in the sense that at the Grange, I do think they're gendered in the sense that one's very masculine and one's very feminine, these spaces. But at the Grange, it's very hierarchical. The servants know their place and they don't really step beyond it. Perhaps Nellie does a little bit, but at Wuthering Heights, often Zilla comes out swinging a bloody saucepan, and even the dogs kind of have free reign. It seems to be a very kind of inclusive place. I think there's a lot of problems to what I'm saying there in terms of inclusive. It tends to be kind of dictated not by democratic argument, perhaps more by violence and kind of who can shout loudest. But it is a flatter, more open space, whereas the Grange is much more civil, but also much more hierarchical in terms of class. Anyway, going back to the idea of Wuthering Heights being kind of having specific aspects of romance, definitely if you're looking at kind of the style of representation, there's a lot more metaphor, there's a lot more personification. Spaces are used to represent mental states more often. So the novel the language of the novels open up more compared to, say, Pride and Prejudice, to using language to explore and to using physical objects, to explore mental feelings. There is also just general narrative kind of forms of romance. Heathcliff kind of transcends social problems like class. So Heathcliff is forced to become a poor stable boy, a kind of agricultural laborer who has no agency. What does he do to kind of overcome that? Do we know? Like, how does Heathcliff return and kind of achieve revenge? I feel like I'm pressuring you to kind of answer questions about a novel you're just getting into, but when you do kind of get to that stage of the novel, kind of consider, how did Heathcliff kind of get the power that he gets in the world? What's going on there? In terms of romance, it's not really explained. So when we think about like narrative structures and kind of how realism might explain the social world and constrict characters, Emily Bronte seems to have made a decision to give Heathcliff some magical type powers. I don't mean magical as in kind of ghost powers or superpowers. She just seems to have endowed him with a certain amount of wealth. Having said that, although Wuthering Heights has a great deal of romance, it is also perhaps more realistic in the style or the minute descriptive technology of the narrative. It's very vividly painted in terms of the social world, the economic world, the political realities of the time, but also the environment. Did any of you guys find the way the world was represented more captivating? From what you've read thus far?
I did think that in some ways it usually foreshadows what's about to happen. So I'm not sure if I would have said it was more captivating, but I can definitely kind of get an idea of what's about to happen based on what's going on in nature.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, Camille, in the sense that, for instance, at the very beginning of the novel, when Lockwood asks the story of Heathcliff's life, Nellie says it's a cuckoo story. Sorry, a cuckoo story. Does anyone know what a cuckoo bird is? It is, but a different one. A cuckoo bird, or what about cuckoldry? I guess we're talking about romance, so we can talk about cuckoldry, I guess. A cuckoo bird is a bird that doesn't lay its eggs in its own nest. It flies into the nest of another bird, lays its eggs, and then kicks out the eggs of the other birds. So to Camille's point about things being predicted by the natural environment, that's definitely the case. But if we recall Austen's world, you occasionally find a tree being represented. I think Mr. Darcy's place has some nice Spanish chestnut trees, but Wuthering Heights has moss, it has fungi, it has moths, it has tons of different birds, it has tons of different animals. It's very much vividly represented. It's very realistically represented. There's an ecology in Wuthering Heights. There's an environment. There isn't really any of that in Jane Austen's world. There's also dialect. People speak like we kind of all kind of speak differently. In Yorkshire, people have their own little language that they speak, and that's represented too as well, which adds to the realism. The themes are almost kind of much more prevalent. So you have issues to do with domestic violence, cruelty against animals. You also have themes like child abuse, issues of racism, themes of adult illiteracy, religious fanaticism. You have really big social problems being dealt with by Emily Bronte. You also have a whole lot of violence in the novel, perhaps too much. And we'll talk about that when we look at the Gothic, because I think we need to get to the bottom of why so much violence. Almost at our last reading activity before kind of we call it quits for the night. Wuthering Heights is also very different, and I think I mentioned this when we looked at Pride and Prejudice, in that it's an anti-pathetic novel, in the sense that whereas we looked at sympathy, sympathizing with characters like Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Sympathy, of course, relates to our ability as readers to imaginatively feel and live vicariously and therefore identify with another person's predicament. This was very central to the kind of foundations of the novel. What Wuthering Heights does, and the reason why it's quite unique, is it's a novel in which you kind of don't end up really liking the characters so much, particularly Heathcliff. As Caitlin mentioned, Heathcliff is an ambiguous character. You kind of love him and hate him, but you kind of end up deciding, no, he's hitting women, he's abusing children. You can't really like this person because of that. Can anyone think of contemporary heroes or protagonists in narratives that tend to be antipaths, or you end up watching a TV series and not liking the protagonist?
I'm not sure if this is just me, or if anyone else watched this show, but seasons like 1 to maybe 3 of Chicago Med, absolutely disliked Natalie, who's like one of the main doctors. Oh my God, I couldn't stand her.
Do you think you were kind of, I haven't seen Chicago Med, but were you kind of, has anyone else seen Chicago Med? Is anyone having disagreement with Olivia here about kind of, no? Were you set up not to like that character, Olivia? Or
No, she just irritated me.
Oh, okay. It was just a general dislike.
No.
Okay. Can anyone else think of any characters that kind of are protagonists in narratives and you end up hating them because they are morally bankrupt by the close of the narrative or the series?
I do have an example. I don't know if everyone knows this. I can't exactly say it if it is a spoiler if anyone's watching, but it's a manga called Attack on Titan, and it's like Eren. So you grow up liking the character. He ends up being somebody who was like, a lower class, a lower position in society. He finds out a lot of oppression and what other people have been doing to like his place. And then he ends up making a decision where people started loving him and he was the hero. And then he ended up doing wanting to do one of the most atrocious things by the end of it. So it's really interesting.
Great point, Kayla. Yeah, I do think you'll find a lot of narratives actually are about antipathy rather than about sympathy, because we don't actually live in a perfect universe. People often have to make immoral decisions. I was actually thinking about these 3 kind of douchebags. Did anyone see Breaking Bad, for instance? Does anyone remember Breaking Bad? I can't even remember this guy's name, the one in the middle.
Walter White.
He starts out quite a positive character who starts, well, he's not positive, I guess, because he's making drugs from the outset, but he just becomes worse and worse and worse. Does anyone remember Mad Men, that TV show about advertising gurus? You have a protagonist, Donald Draper, who's kind of likable at the beginning, but he just gets worse and worse. He becomes more and more immoral. Likewise in The Sopranos, there seems to be a discontinuous theme here where it tends not to be women who are represented antipathetically, but usually patriarchal douchebags like this, because they end up becoming very immoral by the end of the narrative. It was quite radical for Emily Bronte to write a novel where you don't sympathize with the protagonist. And I think that's one reason why she probably copped so much criticism for her novel. And we'll see the criticism when we look at some early reviews of Wuthering Heights on Wednesday. Other aspects to do with realism, class, and gender, they play a huge role. Houghton and Heathcliff, to a certain extent, are made into agricultural labours through human intention. To a certain extent, they're made evil. And I wanted to ask this, are people born evil or do they become evil? In the case of Heathcliff, what do you think, Caitlin? Because you've I think you've dug into the novel a bit. Is Heathcliff born evil? Yes, well, Heathcliff's a good example because, as Camille and some of you who have read the novel kind of may know, which I think everyone's kind of in the minority here because, it's Monday, week 2, you've all been absorbed in Pride and Prejudice, and the unit hasn't given you much time to read Wuthering Heights. Is Heathcliff abused? Camille, I might ask you because I think I recall you saying you had 3 hours to get through it, kind of the last. Is Heathcliff kind of abused growing up?
Yeah, definitely. Most of his family dislike him and are very, very, very brutal towards him. Bar the father, like Earnshaw Senior, but he soon passes away, and then Heathcliff is left with the rest of the family, who very much dislike him. So he suffers significantly.
Yes, yes. Even Kathy at the beginning doesn't like Heathcliff. Even Mally doesn't like him. She puts him outside in the cold, kind of on his first night of being introduced. Hindley, Catherine's brother, is extremely cruel to Heathcliff. So he has a childhood when violence kind of is quite perfectly naturalized. Very different, I think, from representations of class in Pride and Prejudice, where kind of someone's just born working class or someone's born of the servant class. And when they try to move up, eventually it's shown that they shouldn't move up. They should just remain like George Wickham and not try to kind of become a gentleman. It's very different in Wuthering Heights because you get this narrative that shows you that both class and gender, because Catherine Earnshaw is a good example, she kind of becomes feminized mid-novel, whereas in her early years, she's just like Heathcliff. She's just this little dirty girl who loves running around the malls and having a good time. So a big difference and something to note when you read Wuthering Heights is that class and gender are shown to be processes. They're shown to be social processes that act upon people rather than kind of something you're innately born into. And you definitely see that with evil. And I think that's something quite radical about Wuthering Heights is Emily Bronte tries to point out to a Christian public that evil's something we create as a community. We actually generate evil. No one's born innately evil. We produce evil. It's a byproduct of our own kind of social failings. But I want to stop rambling on now because we've got a little bit of time left. And I want to look at representations of emotion and look at kind of some passages from Pride and Prejudice and some passages from Wuthering Heights, and let us gauge the difference and gauge how we're moving away from a certain form of representation, a form of realism, to a more passionate, perhaps more romantic depiction of emotion. We got 2 short readings to do, and then I think we'll call it the day. We'll call it the night, sorry. I want to ask you to consider 3 questions here. What type of language does Jane Austen use, and what type of language does Emily Bronte use to represent passion in these 2 following passages? And they're both representations of what you would call a man violently in love or violent passion. Consider this: is one representation more realistic than the other? And which representation in the end do you prefer? With the 2 questions here, if you think one's more realistic than the other, try to explain how. And if you prefer one more than the other, try to explain why. And I might look for 2 more readers for this. This is from Pride and Prejudice. This comes from a discussion between Elizabeth Bennet and Mrs. Gardiner, and they're describing Mr. Bingley's passion for Jane. Could I ask maybe Soleil or Solil, you've been kind of very quiet. Could I get you to play Mrs. Gardiner? You'd be the black one, the black text here. Thank you. And are you there, Clara? Shania, could you play Elizabeth?
Sure.
So this is a dialogue between Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner where they're discussing Mr. Bingley's passion for James. Jane, take it away, Shania.
It does not often happen that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl who he was violently in love with only a few days before.
That expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite that it gives me very little idea. It is as often applied to feelings which arise from half hour's acquaintance as to a real strong attachment. Pray, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love?
I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be finer symptoms? Is it not generally incivility the very essence of love?
Thank you. Is this profound passion here? What's going on? Is this very keen observation? Is this what happens? Have you noticed any of your friends when they fall in love, they're a bit like this? They're like, hey, Shania, I want to go out and see a film on the weekend. And your friend's like, well, no, you're in love with someone, Shania. So you're like, to me, nah, sorry, I'm in love with someone. I don't have any time for you. Does that happen? Do people just snub people because they're violently in love?
I think not to that extent. I do think it happens, but not to that extent. I think sometimes when someone is in love, they can make that the entire life at that point. So anything that wants to be done, they only want to do with that one person.
Does anyone have any anecdotes of a friend who kind of just got so infatuated with the person they were in love with, they just never heard from them during that period? I think it kind of happens. Yes, Caitlin, you're nodding. Is not general incivility the very essence of love? Was Mr. Bingley being uncivil? Like, what did he do? What made him so kind of violently in love here? Like, he just refused to dance with a few ladies, and that rendered him violently in love. Bear this representation of violently in love in mind. I think I'll skip over this passage, which describes, I'll read it actually. Maybe I'll, go back. Maybe I'll read the third person narrator. Camille, can you read, who is that? That's Darcy. Can you play Darcy in the blue?
Sure.
Elizabeth was too much embarrassed to say a word. After a short pause, her companion added,
You are too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on the subject forever.
Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change, since the period to which he alluded, as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. A man violently in love can be supposed to do. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her of feelings which, in proving of what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. They walked on without knowing in what direction. There was too much to be thought and felt and said for attention to any other object. Is this representation of their kind of connection, is this violent love? What is violent love? Is this, are they really kind of, as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do? Yeah, it's like I think they're walking without knowing in what direction. We've all done that. Like I've gone for a walk with a friend and had a great conversation, and oh, we've been talking for hours. I don't even know where we are. I think violently in love here is kind of, you can see there's a bit of love going on here. How much more have we got here? I think I want to read now a passage from Wuthering Heights, a very different form of love. But this passage comes from chapter 16, and it describes Heathcliff responding to the news that Catherine, his love, has died. And I'm thinking we won't read it all, but I might just quickly read the very end. Heathcliff is talking to Nally, and he's been waiting outside the Grange to kind of find out kind of how she died, if she is dead. And he asks Nally, he says, and did she ever mention me? He asked, hesitating as if he dreaded the answer to his question would introduce details that he could not bear to hear. Her senses never returned. She recognized nobody from the time we left her. She lies with a sweet smile on her face, and her latest ideas wandered back to pleasant early days, her life closed in a gentle dream. May she wake as kindly in the other world. So clearly Catherine Heathcliff, love, she's died. Catherine Lindley or Catherine Earnshaw has died. This is what Heathcliff says. May she wake in torment, he cried with frightful vehemence, stamping his foot and groaning in a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murderer do haunt their murderers, I believe. I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always, take any form, drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. Oh, God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. He dashed his head against the knotted trunk and lifting up his eyes, howled, not like a man, but like a savage beast being goaded to death with knives and spears. I observed several splashes of blood about the bark of the tree, and his hand and forehead were both stained. Probably the scene I witnessed was a repetition of others acted during the night. It hardly moved my compassion. It appalled me. Still, I felt reluctant to quit him. But the moment he recollected himself enough to notice me watching, he thundered a command for me to go, and I obeyed. He was beyond my skill to quiet Orcan's soul. Is that a lot different in terms of representation of violent love? Like, what's Heathcliff done after he's responded to Catherine's news that Catherine's died? He dashed his head against the knotted trunk. He like grabs a tree and smashes his head against it, and he casts the curse on Catherine. He says, "Oh, you're not going to heaven. I curse you. You will walk the earth as a ghost." Which passage do you think is more realistic? In terms of violent love, is it ridiculous to say one's more realistic than the other? Yeah, I think Heathcliff's kind of, I'd say not the norm, but we're talking about profound grief here. But is there a lot of metaphor going on here if we go back to this representation of kind of he howled. He howled. Is this a little unrealistic?
Yeah, it's almost a bit romantic, like in this sort of, harks back to like mythical creatures like ghosts and
The
and
werewolf,
stuff like that.
perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one very interesting thing that no one's ever written about Wuthering Heights is Heathcliff's often referred to as a wolf, which kind of is typical of Gothic fiction more broadly, but Yorkshire was actually known as one of the last areas that wild wolves kind of moved around in Great Britain, Scotland being the kind of better known area. He is a bit of an endling, like the last of his kind. But when he lifts up his eyes and howled, not like a man, but like a savage beast being goaded to death with knives and spears, that's very romantic, isn't it? Not romantic in the sense that someone gave someone a box of chocolates with some flowers. It's more an extreme representation of passion. And then he's turned to self-harm. It may seem very extreme, but self-harm does happen, doesn't it? Like at a very extreme form of psychological trauma, people will self-harm. And I am thinking, if we're thinking about realism here, Heathcliff does seem to kind of, even though it's a very extreme representation, to behave in kind of a more realistic way in terms of emotion. Which representation, if I can ask, did you guys prefer? Austen's Bingley, his passion, or was there something endearing in Heathcliff's meatloafian doing anything for love? Perhaps. I don't know. Was it too much for you, Sarisha, that Heathcliff's kind of, he's too over emotional?
I don't know. I think it's one type of violent love. Maybe like when he go to the extreme, he might have done that. But yeah, I agree. Which one I feel more better. I think I prefer the Wuthering Heights. I feel like connected somehow. I'm not sure why. With Pride and Prejudice, it's like, oh, okay, I'm reading a novel. I'm not completely sunk in there because of, I don't know what's the reason, but Wuthering Heights I love so much.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a great reaction to the novel. I can remember the first time I read Wuthering Heights, and kind of, it was just entering another world. And I think I'll talk about this at the beginning of our next session, but there are different types of art and different types of literature. Pride and Prejudice does very important things kind of in terms of gender and society and representations of class and comedy. But Wuthering Heights is kind of a work of art, kind of in the sense that it takes you away and kind of puts you somewhere kind of that you've never really been before. But I might stop the share now and kind of, it's 8:52, and I feel like this is an elimination where I've kind of slowly kind of, I don't know whether things are getting worse and worse or kind of, but thanks guys for hanging in until the end. Next session, we'll look at Wuthering Heights in the Gothic, and we'll look particularly at representations of the sublime, which I kind of think we may have seen there a little bit, where it's a more painful kind of horrific form of emotion being represented as opposed to Pride and Prejudice. But we are moving away from that very kind of sterile realism that we found in Pride and Prejudice. Any questions before we call it a day? How we feel like we're going in terms of kind of progressing okay? Hands up, Jamie, go for it.
Yeah, I had just a quick question about the second assessment presentation.
Yep.
For those, and more specifically me, who can't attend that class, is there an alternate way we can submit the presentation rather than presenting in class?
Okay, I would like you to attend, but do you have something that forbids you from attending on Monday?
Yeah, I have something on.
Okay, well, you can, I guess, record your presentation on Panoptico and upload it. So that's something I've done in the past for students that who cannot present on the day. So you can do that, Jamie, that'll be fine.
Cool. I'll see if I can attend. Like I would like to, but yeah, I just don't know that I'll be able to.
Okay, is it work or like if it's something serious, then I understand why you couldn't present then. It's going to be good generally for everyone during the day because you'll be able to hear what everyone else is thinking and doing. So it'll be helpful in terms of that, but perfectly understand. You'll just have to record a video and you'll be able to upload that via Collaborate. So yeah, don't worry too much about that, Jamie. It kind of happens a lot of times where students, maybe they have teaching stuff that they can't get out of doing, or maybe they have work things. So yeah, that'll be fine.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Olivia,
yeah, my laptop just died, but I'm back, obviously. Was that question about missing Monday's class? Because I sent you an email about that. Is it all right if you...
Oh, really? Did you?
Yeah.
Did you send that just before? I imagine?
Yeah, I sent it on the break, but it's okay. You can reply to it like later. It's fine. I just wanted to let you know that I've sent you an email about it.
Oh, yep. Yeah, I see it. Well, Jamie just asked because she can't make it to Monday if she can present. You can just record a video and that will be fine as well. It is a little bit kind of, well, it's not problematic, but because the whole idea of it originally was for you guys to be presenting real time. So you stand up and kind of go to give you kind of experience presenting, because a lot of people have struggled doing it, but we're on Zoom, so I don't think it matters too much. So yeah, if you need to record a video, that'll be fine. I can't not kind of say no as well. Like I have no power in that respect as well. And I don't like having power anyway, so it's fine by me. Less power I have, the better.
Cool, thank you. Sorry.
No worries. I'm so pleased, Sarisha, that you were being very quiet this whole session and then you said at the end, oh, I really love Wuthering Heights.
Yes, I was thinking about talking it, but always someone wants to talk it, so I was just quiet and listening, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, jump in. I don't like selecting people and saying, hey, speak now. Jamie, your job is to speak now. Jamie just left right at the time. But I kind of leave it out there for a bit of silence. But yeah, I actually don't mind that the class sizes are reducing because we kind of get down to a good kind of group. I don't find anyone can teach with 30 people. When I did this unit as a student, there were about 5 people in the tutorial. And that's not because the university was like, let's have small tutorials. It was just because a lot of people just never came, because it is reading intensive. And it can get quite boring if you don't know what I'm rambling on about, because there is a bit of a context required to understand what we're discussing. But yeah. Have you read any other Bronte fiction, Sarisha?
No, I haven't. This is the first one I read, but like how you mentioned, I think Jane Eyre, I think I would love to read it when I finish this unit.
Yeah, well, Jane Eyre's not as violent, and it's a very pleasing novel. Wuthering Heights has a I don't want to spoil it if those of you are getting to the very end of it, but it leaves you with a kind of sense of dread and a sense of, what is the meaning of life, which is a really good thing. And that's what a lot of good literature does. It asks you to really question, are people born evil or are they created evil? Or, what happens after we die? Is there something more to life than marrying Mr. Darcy? These questions really get asked in Wuthering Heights. Jane Eyre in a similar way, but a little bit different. But yeah, definitely worth reading Jane Eyre. Agnes Grey as well. All of their novels are kind of, they're standalone works. You'll never read anything in all of English literature like Wuthering Heights. No one's kind of written anything like it, and they never will. It's really sad as well. I think this will be a talking point when we come back to looking at Wuthering Heights on Wednesday. Emily Bronte got no praise for her novel whatsoever. And maybe there was one reviewer that said it was kind of good and she cut it out and put it in her drawer. and everyone just bagged it and said it was horrible. And at the same time, Jane Eyre was published, and everyone said this is the greatest novel ever written. This little lady's a genius, or this little man's a genius. Imagine having a sister who like succeeded in that respect, and you kind of failed. And it took about 100 years for someone to come along and say, you know, this novel's actually really, really important and really, really good. And no one kind of gave her the praise that she deserved. That's kind of life though, isn't it? Anyway, let's call it a day. This is the first session for Wuthering Heights. I hope you're doing well, Camille, in terms of the hours.
Yeah.
Are you're still up and it's like 3 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah, it's 4. And excitingly, there's going to be a time change next week. So it will be 2 to 5.
Jeez.
That's
Oh.
fun.
Ah,
It's technically still the same like experience to me. It's just like the time is different, right?
That is some
Yeah.
serious dedication. My God.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
oh, really? Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Oh, great. Let's hope, yeah. No, that's fine. I think that's really good. Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, to sympathize and kind of, Camille, I've got to get up at 3 o'clock on Thursday because I got to help my sister. She's a florist, buy her flowers for her florist from the market. You know, you go to florists and they've got all the flowers. You have to like get up at 3 in the morning to get them. So I'll be up at 3. Yeah, but I'll be up at 3 and talking at 6. But that will be our first session on Tess. But yeah. But keep reading, guys, and start thinking about your long essays because you've got to make the plan during the week and present it next Monday. Until then, I think we can call it a day. Thanks, guys. Thanks for hanging in there. And I'll see you on Wednesday. If anyone has any questions, I always feel like you're hanging on until the very end or something, but I also think like you're just hanging on. Yeah. Do you know the thing that's annoying is I can't, this is what sucks about Zoom. And I think like you guys would get together and chat if it was in real time. I can only end the meeting for all. Like I have to kind of close it down. I can't just leave you guys to chat because of the way it's set up. So I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I'll see you all on Wednesday and take care until then and get to finishing Wuthering Heights. See you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.